Welcome back to the Judo Fanatics podcast. Today's guest joins us from Sydney, Australia. He is a lifetime judoka and a dual citizen who has national championship titles from both Australia and the United Kingdom. He is the founder of the Judo Way of Life, which is an online portal and podcast for all things judo. You can find his instructionals at judofanatics.com titled Fancy Feet, Awesome Yashuaza, and It's All in the Hips. As always, I wanted to remind you to give us a follow on Instagram and our Facebook group, both great places to share lots of cool judo content. You can also give me a follow personally on both Facebook and Instagram under the handle CJ Judo. My name is Chuck Jefferson, and it is a pleasure to introduce this week's guest, Mr. David Groom. All right, I'm joined here with David Groom. David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining me. We're off by a couple of time zones, so it's quite interesting. I told my kids I was going to interview you, and I reminded them that David is already on Saturday morning, and here we are on a late Friday afternoon. But it's a pleasure to be with you, and look forward to the conversation.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah, actually, when you sent me through that first timestamp, the panic set in. I was like, oh, where are you located? Just trying to do the maths, trying to figure it out.
Right.
But you've done the hard work for me, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get into it, I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people on the podcast, a lot of amazing champions and people of all walks of life, but there's so many people out there that are doing big things for judo. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm interested in. I love to promote those who are passionate about the sport of judo, which we all are. I think all of our listeners are in some fashion or form very interested in the growth and the development of the sport of judo. And I've seen everything you've done from, your podcast and your website and your teaching, your, instructionals that you've done with Judo Fanatics. So I definitely wanted to reach out to you and just, share your story with our listeners. So I thought it would be a great conversation. So I want to get started with your background. Like we always ask in the beginning, how did you find judo? Is this something that you did since you were a child?
Yeah, so I'm from a small town in the north of England called Bacup, and just so happened to have one of the strongest judo clubs in the country at the time. And I went there when I was about 5 or 6, and it was a very competitive club, even for kids. It was quite a competitive club, and I hated it. I did about a month there, got beaten around a little bit, just didn't like it at all. And then fast forward a few years, my little brother, he hit the sort of 5, 6-year-old point, and he was like, I want to do judo. I thankfully, being competitive, I was like, well, okay, well, if he's going, I'll go.
Right. I
was 9 then, and then, sort of really got into it at that point. It wasn't a smooth journey from there onwards. I was, I'm not going to say I was a soft kid. So I had ADD, and I think with that, I become very overwhelmed by things, and like a big shift in emotions would sort of overwhelm me, and I'd sort of panic, and then going into a new environment, being in judo, getting beaten around effectively.
Yeah.
As a kid, it was a bit overwhelming. So there were times when it sort of took me off guard as a kid. So I'm not going to say it was a smooth ride from 9 years onwards, but definitely stuck at it from then. So I'd say I've been doing it about 25 years now.
Wow. So do your family know anything about judo? Like, I'm curious as to like that's always a curious thing for me, is like, why is it that your family in the UK chose judo for you when you were 5? And then again, even after you didn't like it, your little brother, like, why is it judo?
Well, like I said, small town, north of England, not very many opportunities. Okay. Very low socioeconomic area. And basically the only other sport was soccer.
Got it.
And don't play well with others. So I ended up, I was a very individualistic kid.
Sure.
And my little brother was actually, quite the same. He was a bit more into sort of team sports. He played a bit of cricket and things, but still, so judo was basically, as I say, the judo club was above the library, right in the center of the town. So it was reasonably well known. And the coach there, Brian Moore, who's still coaching there now, he's been there since, I think, the 60s. And he was the cadet squad manager at the time. Okay. So, there was a lot of that the British team would train for the cadet squad in the town. So
got it.
It would get quite a bit of an attraction where there was nothing else like that in the area. And so it was quite well known. So that's, one of the reasons really got into it. And then going back to my ADD, it attracted me when I was 9. the fact that there was so much going on actually had a strange calming sense on me.
Interesting.
As well as, I know I mentioned that, you know, I always get the emotional bit as well sometimes, but the overall, the structure of the judo and the, you know, different throws, and you're doing the randori, there's just so much going on. And I find it quite calming. And it helped me a lot as a kid. And I can only reflect on that now as an adult. As a kid, I had no idea what was going on.
Right.
I was like, oh, I like this. So at the time, I had no idea. I was just like, okay, this is good fun. I can fight people. I'm not getting told off for wrestling like I was at school. You know, if me and my brother are fighting at home, we'd get told off, but then go to the judo club and they're like, crack on.
Right.
You know? So I was like, all right, this is awesome. So, yeah.
It's pretty interesting to me to hear like there's these little pockets around the world, because as a whole, judo in most places is not super popular, but then there are these little pockets in small towns in every country. You know, there's certain small towns, like I came from a very small town in California. Judo is definitely not popular, but the guy who I grew up with, Ernie Smith, he had been in this judo club, or he ran this judo club in this small town for more than 30 years. So there's like multiple generations of kids. So within that small town, although judo's still not popular, it's known and people talk about it. And he's kind of got this, you know, people talk about his program, and it's known in the community to be a good place to send your kids. And I think that happens in a lot of ways all over the world. And that's like how we grow judo, one small little club at a time.
I think it's the, where there's a passionate individual. So like I say, Brian Moore, my coach, is an incredible human. He's just so passionate about the sport. And like even now, like I've been living in Australia for 6 years. You know, he's still my judo coach. And if I needed him for anything, I know I could ring him and he'd be there for me. And you know, it's just that passion, and I think people will gravitate towards that. And I think, from my experience, like you say, like so, when I trained in Kendall Judo Club, you know, Kendall's well known for judo, and again, it's just those little personalities. So like Tony McConnell, Mike Liptrot, that's there now. And then the same moving to Sydney, there's like little pockets around the city where there's these people with very large personalities, very passionate about the sport, and people I think just gravitate towards that.
Right. So you spent most of your childhood or all of your childhood in the UK. So you grew up in the UK, and I know that you had some great success as a competitor in the UK. Tell us about your competitive days, the prime time of your athletic career.
Yeah, so I mean, I started competing, I think, after a month of doing judo. The coach was like, do you want to have a go? And I was like, yeah, all right. Got beaten up. I remember it quite vividly, actually. I got beat by 4 people, and I went off to have a little cry in the changing rooms. Right. And then the table official came and gave me a telling off. Never leave the table again. Right. And I went back and I was all crying. It turns out I had one more fight. I went out and threw this lad in the first sort of 5 seconds, and I was like, all right. And then pretty much from there onwards, I was sort of like, I was hooked on it, and you know, sort of got rolling along. And at the 11, so after a couple of years, I was invited to start training with the Northwest area. So that's the area of England. And again, that was like a bit of a big jump for me. And, you know, as I mentioned, you had sort of those overwhelming moments. That was like one of those sort of moments where at first I was like a bit hesitant, and then got into it. And through that, I went to completed my first national championships, got beaten up there. Pretty much, and you know, then carried on, and then, you know, got to did the first competition abroad. I went to Sweden, I think, when I was 12, and it was just these little moments where, you know, I'd sort of pretty much just get beaten up, have not a terrible time, but like I wouldn't do well. But thankfully, the support of the coaches and my parents just kept, you know, keep going, you know, trusting the process, and then started to sort of come good. Maybe 13, 14, started to start having, you know, like higher level success. Won my first medal abroad, won my first national championship medal, and then, you know, I sort of started to roll on from there, and got selected for the Cadet European Championships at 15, which was probably like the first really big major tournament that I did. Right. And I went with, I think I'd only ever won one other medal in Europe abroad, before that. You know, so went with absolutely zero expectations of anything. And I think it put me in sort of the best possible mindset really for the competition. I had an absolute blinder of a day, right? And came away with a bronze medal. And that sort of, from that point onwards, it was like a real turning point, because I think people started to go, oh, okay, well, you know, maybe there is something here. Yeah. And, you know, I got sort of fast tracked onto the junior team. I was taken to a few junior tournaments from there. And from that moment really was where, things sort of changed competitively for me.
What's the identification process like in the UK? I mean, you're 15 years old as a cadet. That's actually a pretty young cadet, because cadet typically goes, there's 16, I guess 15, 16s for the most part. So after you win a bronze medal at the Europeans, that's a pretty major event. Are people in the UK like, is the phone ringing? They're like, okay, what's next? So here's what you got to do. You got to move to a new training center. What's it like at this point when you win this tournament or you take your bronze medal?
Yeah, like I said, I got fast-tracked onto the junior team. At the time, that was being run by Graham Randall, I think was coaching, and Neil Eckersley was with it, the coaches around that time. And I got taken to some of the junior A tournaments. I think it was Lyon in France, competed there, and the junior A tournaments in Poland, I think were my first two. Yeah, from there, so it was, getting invited more to Bisham Abbey was a training centre. So I was a bit too young to obviously be going to any kind of full-time setup at 15. I still had to finish school. Sure. I was still going through all of that type of thing. But I was getting invited to the senior programs, the training camps, and just doing a lot more competing as well. I was competing at that point. The back end of my cadet, I started doing junior tournaments and senior tournaments in 1 year. So it was quite a lot. It was just a lot more training, a lot more competing.
And when you were 15, what weight category were you fighting?
181s, 181 kilos.
So you were a big boy. At 15 years old, you're already 81 kilos.
Yeah, so I moved up to 81s. I think I was like 74 kilos the first time I did 81s. I was 13. And then I was really struggling at 73s. And then I went up to 81s and got silver. Like, had a reasonably big competition in the UK. Yeah. The first one, so I was like, okay, this is my weight now. And then just stuck at 81s from there onwards.
I think as a coach now, I see it because I didn't really pay attention to it when I was a kid growing up. But those kids like yourself that kind of have a growth spurt early and end up in I consider 81s a pretty big category for a 15-year-old kid. And the expectations become higher simply based on your size, right? I mean, I think coaches, people look at you, they expect more out of you. They expect more maturity. Do you have any experiences with kids like that now? I mean, I guess when you look at a kid, sometimes I've got kids in my club, they're like really big kids. And sometimes I forget, I'm like, wow, that kid is still only 10 years old. He just has the body of a man already. And I think it's hard for those kind of kids growing up because the expectations are high and they end up with partners that are much older than them. And that's obviously a challenge as well.
Yeah, that's what happened with me. I remember from sort of like 11-year-old, I was training on the senior program at the class. And I started up, it was sort of I'd do the kids class, and then I'd stay on and do sort of like half an hour, 45 minutes of the senior class at first. And, and then it just sort of progressed from there. I would just do the full, and then it was just don't even bother turning up for the junior class. And when I look back on it, it was hard at the time. But I was very fortunate because again, Bacup, the club I was at, the women's team was phenomenal at the time. We had some of the best women in the country and the world. And I my apprenticeship was basically training with these women. And it was a case of, because I was tall, I was always tall as a kid, and my body grew faster than my brain was able to keep up. So I was a really clumsy kid and I didn't really know how to control my body. Basically, Brian was like, well, if you injure any of these women, you're going to be in trouble. So you better learn to move and relax and sort of, play the game type of thing. So I had a pretty tough kind of run with that. And I'm really fortunate. I think that, I attribute a lot of my growth to that. And then, so moving 12, 13, there was a guy at the club called Clark Nutter. And he was in his 30s at the time. He was about a 100-kilo player. And I attribute a lot of my development to, working with him, because there was, the club sort of died off a little bit around the Olympics in 2004, because a few of the players were competing and they were down in a different training center. So the numbers in the club died. I ended up working with Clark Nutter a lot, and we would just do an hour and a half of throw for throw. Wow. And he would bounce me around the room. Like I'd be flying. And then it just opened up my judo. It was that sort of, you've just been thrown that many times. You're just like, well, and it actually relaxes you. The more you get thrown, I think the better it actually makes you at throwing, because you sort of get that feel for it. And I attribute, a lot of my time to that. So I think working with adults at a young age really helped mature my judo. And I've got a few players. You mentioned that. So I've got a player now I'm working with who's 16, and he's taller than me. He's huge. We're doing a lot of strength work, because again, his body's just grown so fast that he can't he hasn't got the strength and his muscles haven't sort of matured yet. He's got a long way to go for that.
Right.
So, working him on a program just to help build a bit more sort of glute strength, lower back strength, core strength. So when, somebody big grips him over the top, he doesn't just buckle at the waist.
Yeah.
So I think for me, working with a lot of adults at first it was challenging, but looking back on my judo career, I'm really fortunate that I had that exposure, and it's helped me a lot. And I try and now pass that on to the younger players who are, sort of the bigger players in the club. I think, well, I'm now that 30 odd year old,
right?
And I'm helping out now those teenagers that are coming through, and making sure I'm giving them a constructive hard time.
Sure.
So beating them around a little bit, but in a way where hopefully they're going to learn from it, and then also be able to grow as judo players.
Yeah, I think that balance that you're talking about is important, and some people are not good at it. You have like you ever train in Japan, you have the Kohai Senpai system, and you have good senpais and bad senpais. Just because somebody's older than you and they can beat you up doesn't mean that that's all they're supposed to do. And I've seen it go both ways, even in that system in Japan, where you have this older guy who just mistreats all the younger people. And then you have the ones that are true mentors and really have their best interests at heart, and they're really trying to develop them as people and develop them as judo players. And as a coach, that's what we're doing now. But sometimes in the dojo setting where it's not really a coach, maybe it's just a player that's slightly older, that's where the balance comes in. As a coach, I have to kind of intervene and say, hey, look, like this kid's 3 years younger than you. I know he feels strong, but he's significantly younger than you, not as mature. You've got to kind of play at his level and maybe just a notch higher. That's kind of the way I put it.
Yeah, that's something I try with my junior class. So sometimes you have a bit of a spread on the junior class for the kids.
Yeah.
And I'll purposefully put some of the bigger kids on with the little kids, and I'll have a little quiet word with them and just remind them, you look after them, please. Because I think it's good for them to learn. And at that age, they sort of don't always understand their own strength. As a kid, right. They're not that self-aware.
Right.
And I think it's good for them to learn that control. And I obviously monitor the situation and make sure everything's all good. And if it's not going as planned, I'll intervene.
Yeah.
Which sometimes, it doesn't always go as constructively as I'd hope.
Right.
But then I also try and explain to the kids, like, obviously it's my responsibility as a coach to try and help those kids understand what's going on. And to show them, okay, listen, you're a little bit bigger. You're using your strength to dominate someone. Try using technique, move them around.
Right.
And try and educate instead of just telling the kid off and them going, oh, well, you told me to go on with them.
Right.
Why are you now telling me off for throwing this person around? So I try and expose some of the kids to that kind of dynamic early on, because I think it's good for them to learn.
As a teenager, do you remember in your own dojo, were you ever involved much as a coach? I mean, I know a lot of people, end up helping with the kids' classes when you're a teenager, and I feel like it's actually a very good practice as a competitor to be involved in some ways, to be an instructor and to kind of have that, you have a different point of view when you start teaching, because, as all old people, we always say, like, I wish I would have, knew all these things back then. But I think when you're growing up, you're a teenager, it's all about you, right? You're training hard all the time. But if you can step back and say, I'm going to help out those 12-year-olds and see if I can kind of look at it from a different point of view to see if I can help them. And I think there's a lot of benefit I've talked to a lot of really successful judo players, and a lot of them believe that helping teach really improved their own game as fighters.
Yeah, so I was fortunate. I was asked to be like an assistant coach on the junior class back at Bacup when I was sort of 14, 15, around that age. I'd take the warm up and I'd be the coach's throwing dummy for the demonstrations, and then I'd go around and any of the kids needed any help, I'd provide this sort of bit of guidance, but I wasn't really teaching any of the techniques at that time. But then I'd do the randori with the kids, and for me, I could only ever do foot sweeps. That's all I was ever allowed to do on kids, and again, it was using the timing, kind of strength. And, the kids loved being sort of thrown around and, going on with this big kid who was like sort of like 5-6 years older than them. They thought it was great. And for me, what I was told by my coach to get out of it, so obviously there's that mutual benefit in terms of learning, was to practice foot sweeps.
Yeah.
Actually, that was like the beginning of my love for Yashuaza. Was practicing awesome. There, and
I definitely want to. We're going to get to that here in a few minutes, but before we start talking about that, because I know you just did some work with Judo Fanatics on your Yashuaza, which is really cool stuff. So fast forward a little bit, you end up to be at some point you become a senior national champion in the UK, which is to me a very high level judo player. I mean, the national championships in the UK can't be an easy tournament. There's obviously I know a lot of people from the UK over the years, and there's a lot of great judo players that come out of the UK. So becoming a national champion, I feel like you made a very high level. And then at some point you end up in Australia. So tell us how things played out. How'd you end up in Australia?
Do you want the long story or the short story?
Well, you tell me, whatever you think is entertaining.
So my judo in the UK, it definitely wasn't a smooth ride. There's a few ups and downs in terms of my development as an athlete. And that comes down to a lot of the decisions I made. And in terms of, we said before about being a big kid at 81s. So I developed as an 81 kilo player, and I pretty much went past that point, and I was cutting a lot of weight. And I was doing okay at 81s. I think I got like a bronze and a silver at the national championships. And it got to a point though where I was spending more time thinking about losing weight than competing. And a lot of my results suffered because of that. And I got a little bit lost along the way in that respect. My focus was too much on the weight loss, and I had a bit too much of an identity linked to being an 81 fighter. And I was a bit, looking back on it, I was scared about making that transition to 90s. And I'm not scared, but anxious about it, and that stunted my decision to make that move. And then moved up to 90 kilos, and actually, in 2012, obviously we had the London Olympics, and there was a slim to non-chance that I was maybe going to go to. In my head, I was like, right, there's a few people in front of me. Obviously, Ewan Burton was well ahead. There's a player called Tom Reed and Tom Davis, myself, and there's a few others, but all sort of pushing on for that. I thought, let's give it a go at 81s. I'm here now. Let's push on. And obviously, nowhere near type of thing. I was maybe third, fourth, fifth down the line, so I might as well have been last when you're looking at it from that point of view.
Sure.
But I'd booked a trip for after the Olympics. So I booked a trip for 8 weeks in Japan, and then to fly down to Sydney to spend 4 weeks in Sydney, and then 4 weeks in China. Because I just wanted to do some traveling. I wanted to just do some judo. It was the third time I'd been to Japan, but I wanted to just, whilst I was in that part of the world, I was like, let's just see what else is going on over there. So I came down to Sydney. I'd never been here, didn't know anyone here. And then my coach put me in contact with a guy called Warren Rosser, who he's one of the big personalities in Sydney. He's got an amazing judo club at the University of New South Wales. So I was training there.
I've borrowed lots of ideas from him over the years.
Yeah, amazing guy.
Yeah.
So knowledgeable, and then a great player as well in his own right.
Yeah.
And then his kids program is just ridiculous how good it is. And he's just one of those people that's just made to teach kids judo. Very knowledgeable. And so I slept on his floor for for a week, and then stayed at another coach's house as well for a week. And then during that time, I ended up training at a judo club called Zembu as well, Judo Club, and I met Morgan.
Yep.
And a very good judo club, and met all these people, and then carried on my travels. Off I went. Didn't even think ever that I'd come back, or let alone move here. And then came back from Australia, China, and I'd eaten quite a lot of steak pies in Australia, and I'd solidified my position as a 90 kilo player. So I came back, told my coach, I was like, we're moving to 90s.
Right.
And then fought the British Championships, first competition as a 90 kilo player, and got beaten up. It was a big shock. I was just a sort of heavy 81 player. I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't ready for the challenge of fighting 90 kilos.
Right.
And that was in January. For the Nationals were in January of that year. And then they changed it to December. So they had the National Championships twice in the same year. So it was 2013. So I spent all year doing weights and training. And then I had a bit of success at some tournaments in Europe. Got okay. I think I got a fifth, a European Cup. I was in, the momentum was building. And then, fought the Nationals at 90s and had an absolute blinder of a day. Won all my fights. Just everything just seemed to flow. Just everything worked. And that was the story behind the National Championships.
Nice.
And then I sort of took a little bit of a break from judo after that. I was living in Camberley Judo Club at the time. I didn't have a job. I was like living off benefits. And that was like 5 years of full-time training deep. And I was just I just want to give the brain and the body just a bit of a break. I didn't really know like which direction I was going, and like, you know, how much I still wanted to pursue judo as like a high-level competitor. So I took a bit of a break. And then during that time, I was talking to a friend in a New Zealander called Mark Brewer. And we'd met in the UK years ago, kept in touch. You know, we bumped into, he was trying to go for Commonwealth Games in 2014, and he tried to go for the Olympics as well. So, you know, we'd seen each other on the circuit quite a lot around the world. And he was living in Sydney, and I was like, oh, you know, I wouldn't mind getting away, you know, go somewhere different. And then my other friend, Michael Hawley, he was living in Edinburgh at the time. I was like, do I move to Edinburgh? And Mark, you know, he mentioned Sydney and told me about this guy who had a judo club, was looking for a coach, who ended up being Morgan. So and then it sort of came to crunch time, and Mark Brewer sent me a picture from Bondi Beach. And I think it was the winter at the time. And it was glorious sunshine. And then I looked at my phone, I pulled up my weather app, and I looked at Edinburgh, and it was summer. It was like cold and wet. And I was like, you know what? It's time for a bit of sun.
Easy choice, huh?
So I moved over here, and the intent was literally just to do a year and a half, and then go back, which is what I did. I did a year and a half, and then out here, and I moved back to England. Did 2 months in England. I was like, nope, I'm going back to Australia. Booked a flight, came back out here, and I've been here for 4.5 years now since that point. So just over 6 years, 6.5 years altogether. What's
the, I don't know what the long-term plan is for you for like immigration process or like citizenship, or how, is it legal to just show up and start working? Is that kind of a big pain in the neck for a foreigner to come into Australia to do that?
Now, it's changed since I've been here. In the 6 years that I've been here, things have changed, and I think it has got harder. I can't really fully comment on that, but the process I went through, I got a working holiday visa. So I came out here on a working holiday visa. I knew I had the coaching job before I came out here.
Got it.
As soon as we got here, we started processing the paperwork for sponsorship. So Morgan sponsored me to work for him. So I had 4 years on that visa.
Okay.
And then after 2 years on that visa, you can then apply for permanent residency. And I went through a business route. And, you know, in that process, I'd met a girl. So we've been together 4.5 years now. And so plan B was going to be the de facto.
Right.
So if the business visa didn't work out, I made sure I had myself a plan B.
Right.
But yeah, we did it through that. I went, you know, so 2 years sponsorship, and then the application process for permanent resident. So that took about 2 years. So yeah, about 5 years up to that point. And then I got my citizenship this year. So back in June. I got my dual citizenship, so British and Australian. So obviously one of the perks of being part of the Commonwealth means, you know, we can have that dual citizenship. So yeah, it's quite a nice feeling.
Yeah. So
especially the way the world's going, I think having as many options. Passports you can pull out of your pocket to let you in the country, the better.
I imagine that will come in handy at some point. So with back to like the more judo development, now that you've been in Australia for the last, I guess, 5, 6, 7 years, teaching judo at Zenbu Judo, I'm assuming most of the time, how would you compare judo in Australia to judo in the UK?
So the judo in Australia has got, from my experience, has got quite a distinct Japanese flavor to it. Japan's quite accessible from Australia. A lot of the players go there and train. And then from my knowledge, there's been a lot of exchange. A lot of coaches have come down to Australia as well from Japan and coached. Right. So there is that definite traditionalism. I hadn't experienced that in the UK. Okay. Right? The club I went to, you know, we never bowed onto the mat.
Oh, wow.
It was sort of like everyone would just sort of like drip feed onto the mat, and then, you know, we'd finish off with the junior session, and then the senior session would just start, and we'd bow off. And usually the bow off was just an opportunity for Brian to sort of take the piss out of us a little bit for, you know, something that had happened, or, you know, and then we bow off and, you know, off we'd go type of thing, you know. And then we came out here and, you know, so there's a formal bow at the beginning and a formal bow at the end. You know, things were just done in a little bit more of a traditional way that I had experienced in Japan, but hadn't experienced sort of, you know, at a club level in England. before that, to that same degree anyway. And then the judo's taught very similar, I think, as well. There's a lot more focus on sleeve and lapel judo. Being in England, close to Europe, there's a lot more grip fighting, a lot more, for a long time, I thought a lot of throws were done from the top grip.
Yeah.
I thought Haragoshi was done from over the top, and also Togari were done from over the top, just because that's the way I did it. And I just thought doing off the lapel was a variation. And then came out to Australia and under this coaching here, and then obviously having to fall in line with how the club wants things to be coached as well. So I'm obviously allowed a lot of freedom to coach my style of judo, and they like that because it's different. But then also with the foundational work that I do, it was a bit of a learning curve to be teaching judo in a way that was more traditional, and that's been huge for my development as a judo player. I probably learned more maybe in the past sort of 4 or 5 years in some respects than I had done in the sort of 20 years before that about the fundamental dynamics of a lot of the throws that I'd been doing just as competition variants. And I sort of just assumed that's how you do judo. And it was like, some of it was like going back to the drawing board and going, okay, actually, no. Got to control the lapel, we're controlling this, and that's why. And then you can take those principles, once you learn the foundation, you can take those principles, and the same principles apply regardless of where your grip is. So there's a little bit of that in my development coming out here.
I think that for the United States, we're probably just like Australia. We're very, huge Japanese influence here in the United States, especially on the West Coast. Lots of, most of the older clubs were started by Japanese immigrants in the 50s and the 60s at the Japanese Cultural Center. So I think probably every club in the United States, or at least a vast majority of them, do the very traditional bow on, bow off. I do it at my club. I'm not Japanese, of course, but that's just the way that we've all grown up doing that kind of very traditional. And even the way we teach is pretty traditional. There's a lot of newer thoughts, and even here in California, there's a lot of discussion of like, we kind of have this idea of how to do it, but it doesn't work in competition, or, there's these conversations going on, like, why are we still doing it this way? Like, clearly that's not the path to win. And then there's the conversation of, is winning what it's all about? This is the kind of the trickle down of that whole teaching the traditional way. And not that there's either a wrong or right answer. There's just different ways of looking at it. And I think that you're seeing that now with the way you grew up in the UK for 20 years of judo, and then you go somewhere that's just got a little bit of a different twist on it. It's kind of an interesting outtake. Yeah,
well, it's really helped my judo in terms of my competition side, and understanding the principles more. Of really not changed, but sort of honed my competitive skills. Just understanding the dynamics a little bit better about why I'm doing what I'm doing with my hands, with my feet, with the hip placement, and then it's just sharpened up a lot of my competition judo. And I think there's a time and a place for all of it.
Yeah.
I was one of those people that sort of poo-pooed kata as a useful tool. I was assigning the kata, whatever. So something I had to sort of suffer through whilst I was doing the grading at some point.
Yeah.
And it's something I think is now quite an important part of the sport. Definitely not as important or any more or less important than anything. It's like it's a whole. So it's bringing all those pieces together. And I think when a lot of people, you can't, or European style judo, or you'll get beaten by a good Japanese style, and it's like, well, maybe, right. 5 out of 5 times. I'm sure there is the statistics out there. I'm sure there is someone that's done all that, but everyone's beatable,
right?
And I don't think any one style is necessarily better than another. Yeah, obviously Japan had an absolutely incredible Olympics, but are they doing as well in Baku right now?
Right.
It sort of ebbs and flows. Like I remember being in London 2012, and the Russians absolutely dominated the Olympics for the men.
Yep.
And then this Olympics, I don't think they barely got a sniff of a medal, right? And it just sort of that constant changing and shifting, and so I don't think there's any real sort of this is more important than that. For me, they're all equally important. It all comes together to make a full package of a judo player.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about teaching when you're younger, because when you're younger, you never have that thought. Like when I say younger, I mean, even when I was competing through my 20s, like I don't think I cared why it worked. I just wanted to make sure that it worked. Like if I was able to throw somebody, like it was working just fine. And then when you start teaching, when I first opened up my judo club, like I'm in my 30s already, and you start getting some people asking you questions. You're like, why do you do it that way? And I'm like, wow, I never sometimes there's been times where I was kind of stumped as an instructor going, but I got to really think this through. Like, why do I put my foot there? Why do I move this direction at this time? And as an instructor now for the last 10 years, I've put a lot of time and some of these students who sometimes are, ask maybe too many questions. Now as a teacher, I don't think there's really any bad questions. There might be bad timing for a question, but there's no bad questions, and sometimes an athlete that asks me a lot of questions as a teacher, I kind of respect that, and I really enjoy it because it makes me think a little bit more through about what I'm trying to get, in today's lessons. And sometimes if the kids just don't have any feedback, I'm like, okay, I think I covered it, but nobody had anything to say. So let's see. Hopefully they got it, So sometimes those questions as instructors, we need that feedback so we can kind of reevaluate what we're saying or how we're articulating what we're doing with our body.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I always ask questions. And I always encourage all my players, from the kids all the way through to all the adults, to always be asking questions. And as a kid, it was something that I hated at school. I never understood why. You'd ask a question, the teacher would just be like, "That's it. That's the way it is," or "Don't answer back." Or sometimes where the teacher was maybe not in the best frame of mind, and they wouldn't sort of. And it never sat well with me, and I never knew why as a kid. I thought it just didn't seem right. And then as I progressed as an adult, I understand the importance of asking questions. Even those questions, like you said, the kids' questions, and some of them are just like. As a coach, I make sure now that I'm like, do you have any questions about the technique we have just gone through? Because otherwise you are opening yourself up. And I don't want to get any questions. And before you know it, some kid's like, why is my ear tingling? And you're like, oh, well, that's my fault. I didn't create the parameters.
Yeah. I got a hilarious story for you. I brought hiatus to my dojo 5 years ago. And it was pretty cool at the time. This is when Ilias, he kind of first started touring around. So he was still a little bit of a kind of a mystery to the Westerners, like a lot, not like guys like Ilias show up in California very often. So I've got Ilias teaching a kids class and an adults class. And his English was actually pretty good. He was able to, articulate the lesson and kind of talk. And then he doesn't work with these particular kids. He doesn't know any of the kids. And I got this one kid in my dojo who was very new to judo. And he said, does anybody have any questions? And this kid, hand goes straight up in the air. And he spoke kind of fast to where, I think Ilias didn't even understand it. He's like, who's your favorite Ninja Turtle? And Ilias looked at me and I kind of just laughed a little bit, He's like, because I wasn't sure if he knew what a Ninja Turtle was. I'm like, he wants to know who your favorite Ninja Turtle is. That's all that kid. He don't care about that technique you just showed him, but he wants to know who your favorite Ninja Turtle. And he was just stumped. He couldn't even believe it. He's like, I don't know what a Ninja Turtle. So yeah, the kids kind of, some of the little kids, they got a lot of things going on in their mind. You never know.
They keep you on your toes.
Yeah, that's for sure.
They definitely have made me a more patient coach.
Yeah.
And that's why I enjoy coaching kids so much, because you just never know what they're going to come out with. And they're so funny. Like, I've got a kid. So one of the rules I have in my club, so we've got quite a large mat area. I think it's about 20 meters long. So we'll do the gymnastic rolls. You're doing the rolls and the break falls and bear crawl and that. So you go down the mat and they have to run back. And if one kid walks, everyone does 10 push-ups.
Okay.
All right. So I'm just trying to get this culture going. We're doing a warm-up. While you're walking type of thing. That's the way. So I was brought up with it, and I'm like, right, okay, let's keep moving. I got this little kid, he's 5 or 6, called Liam. And I was like, is that right? Come on, everyone run back. And he's doing a slow-mo run. He's like this, doing a really comical slow-mo run. Right. I was like, well, you're not running, but I get what you're doing. So can't really tell you off for that, because you're right.
Yeah,
I just end up laughing. I think there's little comics, the little comedians here. They don't even realize it. So
yeah, I had a super funny one just last week, and it was the first one I had like this. These kids are only 5 years old, and I told the little boy, I said, all right, you're going to go over here with Avery. And he looked at me, he's like, does the big sigh, drops his shoulder. I'm like, why don't you want to go with Avery? Because every time I go with Avery, she always tells me she's going to marry me. I'm like, what? I've never even seen her speak to you. I never knew that was the conversation that was going on. So with 5-year-olds, you never know. So let's talk. I want to talk a little bit about, because we're moving right along here, but Zenbu Judo, I I grew up with Morgan. I mean, not grew up with Morgan, but we're the same era. So we kind of, we're on the world tour. I've probably spent time with him in Korea, maybe even Japan, and definitely hung out with him in California before. Like, you know, we kind of traveled around the same time. So I know it's a great judo club. And I see that you also have been dabbling a little bit in jiu-jitsu, maybe even doing a little competition here and there. As far as your guys' club goes, do your kids do both judo and jiu-jitsu, or is it primarily judo for the kids and the jiu-jitsu as adults, or how does it work?
So until recently, it was primarily just for adults. Okay. And then, so maybe, I think it was beginning of this year, maybe the back end of last year, maybe after maybe last June 2020, I think we set up the junior BJJ, and the class has been primarily the judo play. It's a smaller class. It's not as attracted as many of the kids, right? But it's I don't think it's attracted. It's mainly attracted some of the judo kids that have gone to do like an extra class. And they enjoy it. And I think like a different instructor runs that class at this minute in time. Okay. And I think, you know, for the kids, I think it's good for them to see different coaches as well. Because I'm sure they get tired of me barking at them and telling them what to do. And, you know, they get that different style, and obviously it's different discipline. It's a different sport. So they get that side of things as well. You know, sweeping statement here, but it's relatively similar for kids. I think, you know, there's certain things that are different, obviously. We got a couple of kids train at one of the local Gracie clubs, and they've just come down this past week actually to do a bit of judo. So I had to say to them, you know, because I think they're 9 and 10, and I sort of said, listen, we don't do arm locks and strangles. We're 9 and 10-year-olds here, so just be careful, you know. Don't do any. And then still very good on the ground, probably better than our kids. But as soon as we got standing, a few of our kids were launching them a little bit, you know, so it was quite nice. And they sort of saw and gone like, so they sort of realized that side of things, because we started off with groundwork, and, you know, they were doing pretty well. And and then so the kids class is developing, and I think we're looking to start like more jiu-jitsu, but primarily as a senior class.
Got it. Do you have any thoughts?
I was going to say, sorry, as even as a club though, is the BJJ side's very young.
Got it.
So the judo club, Morgan's been running the judo club. I think it's evolved from 3 different locations. Okay. So when I first came here in 2012, the club was actually in the Sydney Olympic Park. So it was in one of the venues from the Olympics. Wow. And then in the time that I came back to England and then gone back to Australia, it moved to a full-time venue, which is where it is now, where I filmed that most recent Judo Fanatics video. So you see that nice big dojo. Yeah. And that's the full-time setup there. And then, so the judo club had been around for a while. And then once he moved to the full-time setup, they introduced the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I think for seniors, it's only maybe 5 or 6 years old. Okay. So obviously it's getting a lot more established now. But when I first came out here, it was just a lot of white belts. Those white belts are now blue, purple, and moving through. So,
what are your thoughts on training jiu-jitsu for high-level judo? Do you think that training jiu-jitsu for somebody who's on the elite squad that's trying to travel and be part of the IGF tour, how important, or do you think there is much benefit to dabbling in jiu-jitsu while you're training high-level judo?
I think it depends on the individual. So let me go explain what I mean by that. So for me personally, I benefited from doing bits of BJJ over the years. So I first got exposed to it at Camberley Judo Club. They had a BJJ, and we had to do that as part of our training program. And I would say that doing the BJJ really toughened me up, because there's certain things in BJJ you can't do in judo. So I went in there with a bit of a sort of naivety, thinking that in judo, you're not allowed to put your hands in people's faces. You can't just like pull the head back and stick the strangle in. So I'm just like casually, my head's popping out like a turtle. Yeah. And then all of a sudden my head's getting ripped back, and there was a couple of Polish boys there, and they were tough men. And, you know, like just getting absolutely bashed around by them toughened me up. And I would say the nationals, when I won, partly the toughness I got from getting bashed around the BJJ helped me in the nationals. I will trace a direct line from that, that event. And it's definitely opened up my groundwork and helped me. But that's just me. I'm not going to say there's one size fits all. Like my strength and conditioning training will be different to somebody else's. And, sure. The things we use to supplement our training, it's very individual. Like there's a lot of common things, but then there's also a lot of individual things that will, so if someone wants to get better at judo, I'd say do more judo.
Yeah. I think obviously there's a lot of shared techniques and a lot of things that could work really well, but the big difference that is hard to kind of intertwine is the pace. I think that the pace of judo, I have a lot of friends that are really good jiu-jitsu practitioners, and they probably look at judo and they look at our hiatus, or they look at the sequences that happen in a judo tournament, and in their minds think, okay, if I was there, I would have done this, that, the other thing. But the pace really changes things. And when you get on the floor, like I think a lot of people that just look at judo from the outside, they don't feel the conditioning. And in judo, like the pace is such a high level, like people that don't do it don't understand that when you hit the floor, you have a choice that you're making really quick. It's an instantaneous choice of, am I going to proceed with trying to get something on the floor, or am I going to wait for the mate? And that's a choice that people are making every single time they hit the floor. And I think the conditioning and the pace of what it's going to take to actually submit somebody or to pin somebody, it's going to require a lot of energy. And if I miss it, we're going to be back up on our feet in 15 seconds, and I'm going to be exhausted. And I think that that's a thought that a lot of people don't talk about, but that's the obvious, because you see people down there just catching a breath. A little frustrating to watch some of the highest level guys in judo, because I love newaza, and I think that there's a lot of room for improvement, but the rules kind of dictate our behavior, and there's some of the best judo guys in the world who have almost zero ground game, and I wish that they were kind of forced to fight a little bit.
Yeah, it's something I've noticed a lot is how complacent people are in judo on the ground, because you've got, like you said there, you've got to go, you got a split second decision. And I think a lot of the time people go to the ground assuming that person is not going to jump on them and get them.
Yeah.
And people sometimes I've seen people go to the ground and they're not even like full tucked in. They've still got one hand on the gi and they're just sort of like, looking at the referee, and whilst they're looking at the referee, thankfully the other person's jumped on them and they're punishing them. And it still gives me a little bit of faith, because there's still the people out there that are, still pushing for that groundwork to get the finish. But I think some people seem to take it really like a real casual about the defense in ground,
right?
And then they're just making silly mistakes. But yeah, that's what I've come undone a lot in BJJ competitions when I've been beaten. It's because I've just gone too hard. I've just slipped into judo mode and I've just gone, and then again the fights, the 6 minutes, some of the rounds, I just go too hard, too fast, and then by like sort of quite early on, my forearms are blown out.
Yeah,
and then I'm just sort of like, should have relaxed on this one, and then that's when I've sort of been tied up and turned into a pretzel, and yeah.
The pace is different, and it's definitely, different games for sure. I mean, I think that the two work really well together, and I think it's a lot of fun to practice both judo and jiu-jitsu for lots of people. But like you said, I mean, if you want to go to a high level, it's kind of entertaining to listen to people on podcasts or to listen to, some of the feedback you see in some of the forums about, this judo guy will beat this jiu-jitsu. The truth is that no elite judo player is going to become an elite jiu-jitsu player without practicing jiu-jitsu, and vice versa. It's just never going to happen. Yeah. So there's the best jiu-jitsu guys in the world will never make it on the IGF circuit, and it goes both directions. They're very, very, we're specialists. At the end of the day, we're both specialists, and we have rules that dictate why we became specialists at those particular parts of this game that maybe at one point in history was one game.
Yeah, I mean, you see it a lot in other sports. I mean, you'll have it with when these cocky English people come over that play rugby and think we can all of a sudden start playing American football.
Right.
Just because you're throwing a similar shaped ball around doesn't mean there's anything remotely similar, right?
Yeah.
And yes, there are a lot of I use the example of rugby league and rugby union as well. Two completely different sports, but they are similar enough that you can, funny shaped ball, they got to do the goal to try and all that kind of thing, but they are completely different. And you get people doing the crossover every now and again. Someone does okay, but you don't get like high level rugby league players automatically just being high level rugby union players. So for me, it's the same, very similar with the judo and the BJJ. Like if you're going to get wrestling quite often gets thrown into the mix.
For sure.
I know people that enjoy doing wrestling as just a crossover, but for me it's a way of training something that's similar enough that gets you thinking and it gets you active and you're training, but and it adds value,
right?
But because sometimes if just all you're doing is judo, and your brain just gets tired of it and your body just gets tired of it, And then just by doing something a little bit different, will just get you engaged. And then, at the end of the week when you're tired, another judo session, it's like, oh, come on now. Just go and do BJJ. You're like, yeah, no worries. And you end up getting a good hour out of the training session because you're engaged in a different way. So I think it works really well in that context. But yeah, like you say, if you're going to be a high level of any of the disciplines, you've really just got to make that your main focus.
Right.
And that's got to be, what you set your sort of training program around.
Right. I guess it's the truth is that most of these conversations are by very recreational people that, like you said, that crossover may happen just fine. Like a local judo guy may go to some specific local jiu-jitsu school and dominate people, or vice versa. But at the highest level, that's not happening in either direction. I think that's obvious. No. And all the high-level judo and jiu-jitsu guys I know have the utmost respect for both arts, and all of them seem to dabble a little bit. But it's just like kind of a personal preference of mine. I've always loved hiatus, and I just see that in some ways the IJF circuit allows it. It just depends on the tournament, it seems. Sometimes it seems like, wow, they're allowing a lot of hiatus today. And then just when you think they're kind of going to make that shift and allow a little more, then the next event's like, oh, no, they're not allowing anything. So it's very subjective, I think, the way they're refereeing it. Yeah,
I'd like to be a fly on the wall in some of the referee meetings before the tournament starts. And, okay, I imagine they turn around and say, right, well, less hiatus, a bit too much last time, a little bit less. And then what happens is they go the other way. And then the next tournament, they're like, right, come on, guys. We said, tighten it up, but you're giving them 2 seconds on the ground. Then they go the other way and they go too much. And hopefully one day we'll find that nice equilibrium. But one of the things we have out here, so something Morgan, so there's a thing called the Black Belt Registry, and it's all the black belts in, I don't know if I think it might just be our state. You can become a member and they pay a membership, and then that money goes towards training and funding. Like I know they've brought in people from overseas, from Japan to teach and stuff. But that fund, they run a prize fight, and it's a Kosen judo competition. Okay. And they do it as a team event. So every year they have this. So the rules, are you familiar with the rules for Kosen judo?
I'm not sure if I am. I mean, we've had a few attempts at something similar. I don't know exactly how they make the rules, so no.
So, well, the rules we go with, leg grabs are allowed. Everything, all the scoring systems are the same. Okay. But then if you go to the ground, there's no time limit on hiatus. Okay. And you can stand back up and it's mate, but it just continues. There's no area limits when you go to the ground. It just keeps on going. And I'm pretty sure the fight's just 10 minutes, and it's just and it's a really good day. Like, so we do it as teams, and there's no weight groups. It's just a team of 5. You flip a coin, and then one team puts a player up, and then the next team gets picked first. And it's just a good day. And we get some players that just turn up, like never compete apart from in this tournament. Yeah. And it's usually in January, the beginning of the year, just to help people get into it. But it's a really nice sort of middle ground between like the IGF competitions, going to a pure BJJ competition, and you have this Kosen judo, which sort of bridges that gap a little bit.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I've always thought that's the ultimate grappling sport would include tons of negotiations that would never end, but somewhere in between those two, right, where you don't allow the jiu-jitsu guy to pull guard, but you also can't allow the judo guy to avoid groundwork, right? If you put those two together in some way. And I think that prize fighting, before the UFC was so big, and these kind of negotiations have happened for many prize fights over the last 50 years. Okay, I'm going to fight you in a ring, but here's the rules. You got to do this. Here's how long we're going to fight. Once we tie up, you can't punch. Like, I've seen it all. There's so many different types of fights, and everyone's going to negotiate to make sure that their style is the one that's going to win. But yeah, I always did think that the perfect grappling match would be a fine line right there in between the current rule set for judo and jiu-jitsu. So that sounds like Kosen judo could fill that little gap right there, but it sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is. It's good. And it's a team event. I love team events. Yeah. I think they're, because they're individual enough, because you're still the only person out in the middle of the mat. But when you go to a normal competition, like, you only care about yourself. Right. Don't care about what anyone else is doing. But when you've got a team, there's a bit more atmosphere. You're cheering each other on, and they're a nice little change to pace. We saw that at the Olympics when they had the team event, right? The Olympics. Yeah, it was great to see it there. You saw the difference maybe between the teams where they were more encouraging of the teammates versus the other team that was sort of a little bit more reserved. Right. I don't need to name names, or let you pick which one you think I'm talking about.
Right. Yeah, for sure. With the energy and the culture definitely comes out in those things. And it's a lot of fun to see, because I think that's the thing about judo, is that there's so many people around the world that we are following the Japanese culture in some ways. And it's all about reserving and kind of saving face and kind of hiding your emotions. And that's kind of a lot of judo is that way. And then you have the Brazilians who are going to be, celebrating and showing you their true colors and showing you how they feel. But that's also entertainment. People want to see the true emotion. When you look at like Ono, who wins the Olympic gold and really doesn't have any emotion on his face, it's almost strange, right?
Yeah, sort of. In a weird way, right? I always idolized that as a kid. Yeah. I was like, oh, that's cool. I was like, you just won the biggest tournament and then you just tying your belt like it's just another day in the week. I'm like, yeah. Right. Yeah, like I think I was always worried about doing some kind of silly celebration and then and then making a fool of myself. I was like, no, I'm just going to do the calm and casual. But yeah, I get what you mean. It is nice to see. It's nice to see the emotions of the athletes. I think you see that at the Olympics more than anywhere. I think the Olympics brings that out in the sport compared to a lot of the other events. Right. The Olympics really brings out that emotion, I think, in some players.
Yeah, and some players, and even with the Japanese, at the end of the day, the Japanese are so good, and there's so many champions. You go to a place like Tokai University, and you see all the Olympic champions on the wall, and there's so many of them. Like your Olympic or your world bronze medal practically means nothing if you're from Japan, right? If you came, you finished your career and all you got was a bronze at the Worlds was your top. I mean, it's nothing to brag about, So these guys like that are aiming for Olympic gold, like that's what puts them on the pedestal in Japan. Anything less is really not much. So,
two stories, right, that really sort of impacted on me, right? So the first one when I was in Japan, the second time was 2010. So I went out to watch my mate Michael Hawley fight in the World Championships, and then I stuck on. I think I was there for 6 weeks afterwards, and then so Nishiyama won the silver medal, got beat by Iliadis in the final, right?
Yep.
And he trained at Scuba, and then I was at Scuba 2 weeks after the Olympics. The World Championships. He was a Negikomi partner for the University Team Championships.
Okay.
Coming up.
Wow.
And then so Nishiyama, just off the back of a world silver medal, was just Negikomi partner who's just getting slammed around the mat because the rest of the team were going to the University Championships, so they needed people to throw.
Wow.
I was like, man, if someone was like a silver medalist in the UK World Championships, I can't imagine them getting thrown around 2 weeks after the World Championships. And then the third time I was in Japan was after 2012, the Olympics. And it was, I think Tokai had won the University Championship. So I was a bit later on in the year. I was there at the time. And then they had this dinner. So I went along to this dinner. I was like, there's myself, there's actually another Australian there and a Norwegian player that I've known on the circuit. We were there. We were the only three sort of non-Japanese players there. I didn't really know what was going on. I knew he was presenting, and they presented the University Championship players, right? And then there was, I think it was Nikiyama. The 73 boy? Have I said that right? Nikaya?
Nikaya.
Is it 70? Nikaya, sorry. Yeah. Nikaya, the 73 boy, he was there. And then a couple of the girls, I think, medaled. Anyway, they did a presentation for the university team, and then everyone starts eating and, drinking or like going, and then they're like, oh, stop. And then they called back and they'd forgot to announce the Olympic players.
Only in Japan.
I was like, man, if you had, I think there's four Olympic medalists from the club. None of them, they're all bronzes or silver, right? And then I was like, man, if there's like four medalists, if you had four Olympic medalists in England together, that'd be the main focus of the event, right?
Yeah.
And it was just like an afterthought to these guys. I just thought, wow, it just really humbled me, because I was just like, well, these guys are just, forgotten about type of thing, not in a nasty way. Like, well, like I'm nothing special either. So, right. It really sort of helped me to remember not to get ahead of myself, and to put into context, at the end of the day, as much as winning these medals, I'm sure is nice. They are just medals at the end of the day.
Yeah. Speaking of the Olympics, they just made the announcement, I guess, just during the Olympics this year that 2032 is coming back to Australia. So Brisbane Olympics, and it's a little time to go, but time goes fast as we're getting older. Is there already talk of excitement? Are judo players excited that the Olympics are coming back home?
Yeah, there's a little bit. I think the problem is with some of the players, as will have happened for some of maybe the Japanese players, always happens when the home nation, they're going, it's 11 years away, that.
Yeah.
How old am I going to be in 11 years? Am I still, some of them are halfway through their senior careers now, and they think, maybe one more. They go, can I hold on for 11 years?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that going around from some of the players I know, I think. But then, so you look at some of the other players that are younger, who would be in their prime, aiming for something like that. And there's a little bit of excitement. And I think some of them don't quite also understand what it means as well,
right?
Just yet, if that makes sense. I think they haven't been exposed enough to international judo to fully appreciate what it means to have the Olympics in your country. I remember leading into London 2012. Everything was just all the training and all the competitions, everything. Just the buzz around it was just, was amazing.
Not just the players, but I think the coaches. I think the coaches and people like you that run programs are. You understand the significance of bringing home, but there's a lot of different things. There's the possibility of an influx of cash, possibly. There's going to be some investment, and whether that's infrastructure or programs. I mean, a lot of the things can happen, over the next 10 or 11 years, because I'm sure there's somebody in Australia going, how do we get more medals? Because at the end of the day, that's what these countries want to do. And Australia is always one of those countries that's up there in the medal hunt, trying to get medals. And, you can look at a sport like judo and probably doesn't get a lot of attention when it comes to the Olympic Federation within Australia, because it's not a big medal gaining sport. But I would assume that there's somebody there going, what can we do to help judo over the next 10 years so judo does get on the roadmap in Australia? And for me, as a fan of judo, I look at like Australia and, hey, like judo's not a big, Australia's not a big, strong judo country, but hey, hopefully they can do something to change that with the Olympics coming.
Yeah, they've just set up a full-time centre in Victoria, down in Melbourne. So I think that's it's been one of the first steps towards building a stronger pathway, right, to have that support for the athletes that are looking towards. Because up till now, I don't think there's really been much of a. There's been pathways. There's always pathways, but I don't know how managed they've been. I think a lot of players. I think there's been a lot of individual players who have gone off and sort of done their own thing.
Right.
Players have gone overseas, and it's been off their own back to try and find that kind of training centre. So I think it's good that they're building, they've put one in Victoria. It'll be interesting to see how that sort of comes together over the next couple of years with the up-and-coming athletes. There's more interest from the sporting bodies. And you put it into context. So Australia, 3 athletes, top 16. For Australia, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Right? So you got I know they're looking for medals, but still, put into context, it's something to work with.
Right.
And it's just those little baby steps all the time. And there's a lot of people making more noise. He's got Matt DeQuino down in Canberra, is pushing things along. Ivo De Santos, who's also in Melbourne,
right.
He's starting to push things along. I know Matt's been involved in the Judo Fanatics for a long time, and Ivo De Santos has got he's got a new release, and so these coaches are getting more exposure, and they've always been here, but they've just not had maybe the platform to really sort of get their voices heard, and I think that's being noticed more from what I can see, which is good. And from a country who has no real expectations on the judo athletes, it's good. It gives the athletes a chance to actually grow without having that pressure of the weight of the country upon them, right, to really perform, right? And hopefully that will come one day. Hopefully that'll come, and then that's a different challenge for some of the athletes to struggle with. Yeah. And I think including Australia from the IGS point of view, I think including Australia in the Asian region for the Continental Championships, I think that's going to be a big game changer. And it's going to make people have to up their training to be able to compete in that region. I think that's going to really help develop the sport.
Yeah. So tell me about that, or I'm not super aware of how that went down. They took the Oceania Championships. Is that gone? Or?
Yeah. So the Oceania Championships gone. It's now the Asian Pacific Championships.
Okay.
And there just wasn't enough depth of player in the Oceania region. And what it means now is the players they're going to have to up the game.
Yeah.
I'm sure, like, I've done it as well, where I've like rested on my laurels a little bit at times, and it's just not going to allow that to happen. The players are going to have to prove themselves. They're going to have to, be winning medals, and to win medals, they're going to have to be more professional with the training, and it's just going to have that knock-on effect, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely tougher when you got continental championships with the Japanese and the Koreans and the Mongolians, and whole different world than the old Oceania championships, I guess. So.
Yeah, when you compare them to, say, like the Europeans, you look at like the European championships, and then you look at who's in that mix, and then you look at the world, and you look across, and you're like, it's just so strong. The same with the Asian, the Pan America. Is it Pan America?
Yeah, Pan American is a lot smaller as well.
Yeah, but still, it was nowhere near as small as the Oceania.
Right.
If you look at any of the old pool sheets, you'd be amazed at some of the categories had like 3 people in it.
Oh, wow.
You're like, how's that a continental championships? When you compare it to something like the Pan Americas even, right? There's still quite a bit of depth in some, like, you got the Americans, the Canadians, some of the South American countries, some really strong players knocking around, right?
Yeah, for sure.
There's still some depth that you can look at it and go, that's a continental championships. There's players in there that are medaling internationally and, pushing on. And so, I think it's a really good thing for the region.
Yeah. And this has been a lot of fun, man. We're past an hour already. I think you and I can go on this forever. But before we go, I want to talk about your stuff with Judo Fanatics. This is the Judo Fanatics podcast, and you've got 3 titles out with Judo Fanatics right now. Tell us about them. I know you got all about your hips, and you got Yashuaza. And now for me, I'm an old man, and Yashuaza is, hey man, it's old man judo. This is the kind of judo I like to do. I always tell my students, we talk about Yashuaza with the kids. Yashuaza is some of the hardest things to make work in judo. It takes a long time to work on the timing. It seems easy to practice, but it's hard to execute. It's hard to actually become successful with Yashuaza. But once you kind of get that feeling, it's a lot of fun. Tell us about your work with Judo Fanatics, and tell us about some of your DVDs you've put together.
So when Travis asked me to put something together, I went to the drawing board so I didn't really know where to start, and I was like, okay, I want to do one on Yashuaza, because for me, exactly like what you just said there, same feelings towards it. It's so hard to learn, and then once you've got them, it's one of the easiest things to do. Like, it's painfully easy. It takes years. Like, I say this to my students, because you can muscle your way through an ogoshi. Right. You can completely mess up a seanagi, and you can still throw with it because you just drive, and the more you drive with the foot sweep, the further away from it you're going to get. So the complete opposite. So you just can't. It's either on or off. You either can do foot sweeps really, or you can't. But once you can, it's just ridiculous. It's like nothing. Like, you do a diashi harai on someone, and they just fall on the floor, and you're like, is that it? I quite enjoyed that. Anyway, so I started doing this DVD. I wanted it on Yashuaza, and then before I knew it, I'd done an hour and a half just talking about Kuriashi Harai. And the plan was to do Kuriashi Harai, Diashi Harai, and then what became the third one, which was the awesome Yashuaza. So that was meant to be one. And I was like, man, I ended up with 4 hours of footage here. Yeah. So I ended up splitting those 2. I just did one on the Kuriashi Harai and went through basically, how I teach some of my students, so how I learned with the solo movement drills, and then building that up into practical application and using it for setups. And it's just something that's very much ingrained in my judo, and very much something I teach. Pretty much every session I do, near enough, I use Yashuaza as a warm-up. Just get people moving their feet, get them warm, and then we'll do whatever the session is. But for me, like foot sweeps, Diashi Harai, Kuriashi Harai, Harai, Sudakomiyashi, great. All 3 phenomenal throws, love them. And then hip throws, I've always been a big hip thrower. I remember getting asked once what my style of judo is. It's basically I summed it up with to stick the leg across and hope for the best. And I never really had any fear turning in. You get some people don't like turning the backs, and I think this was more back when leg grabs were available. And either people were scared of turning the backs because they're going to get like Tigurumad or Sakuinaga or whatever, and there's that little bit of hesitancy there. I think that's gone. So I think hip throws are a lot more popular now. I mean, they've always been around, obviously, but I think, I've always loved just sending my leg across, harai, just ogoshi, ukigoshi, just whatever, just get my hips across, and just go big. So that's the basis of the all in the hips. And then, so part 3 was the awesome Yashuaza, which was sort of the evolution of that first one, really. Also to Gary, it's just been my favorite technique pretty much from the beginning, really. Also to Oharai, just getting that leg across and just seeing which way we go. Keeps things exciting.
Yeah, of all the judo that I like to watch, I mean, the hips are important. You know, that was a big thing when I was a kid. It was always like, that kid has good hips. Good hips are what makes good judo players typically. And you see the hips in today's game in a big way. And I see, you know, the Georgians. I actually interviewed a few months back was Shadi Almahas. I don't know if you've watched him much, the Canadian player. Amazing Ogosh. He shoots that hip in there, and you know he takes people for rides, and it's a lot of fun to watch once you get people up there.
His interaction with the German,
Frey.
Yeah. Oh, that hip exchange interaction. So I use that. That's one of that's a hip drill exercise. I get my players to do down the mat that my coach used to get me to do, and I was just watching that, and I'm just like, yes. That's the best example. So as soon as I'm like, right, guys, we're doing this hip drill, and I'm like, this is what I want it to look like.
Right.
And I use that video all the time since then. It's it's phenomenal.
And then your Yashuaza, you actually said earlier in the conversation that you kind of took a liking to Yashuaza by working with some of the younger kids when you were growing up. And I think that's important for a lot of our listeners out there to hear. You know, a lot of our listeners are not just judo players, but a lot of them are coaches, and as coaches, we're always trying to figure out how to make these classes work. Like you said, sometimes you've got the big kid and the small kid, but the Yashuaza is something that you can implement into your game and do it in a safe way to where you can play your judo without overpowering a smaller athlete. You can catch them and make it seem like they slipped on a banana peel. And that's Yashuaza. Fun stuff.
Yeah, something Brian was really big on was the Yashuaza. We'd spend a lot of time working on it. And again, going back to what I mentioned about with the training with the women at the club as well. And again, it was like, nope, you're not allowed to do anything that's going to require strength, right? You've got to use technique. So Yashuaza. And it was just foot sweeps and then coaches, oches, these kind of techniques. And that's pretty much all I was allowed to do. And then, so training with the kids and just working that nice light movement and then working with these other players. And then, it wasn't all smooth sailing. I have to mention there's a guy called John Goodwin, who was another one of the older players at the club. And he was a policeman. So he'd work shifts. So we'd always train like 5, 6 in the morning because it would either be at the end of his night shift or just before he went on his day shift. So he'd spend some time with me. And he was just an incredible at working his balance in terms of being light and going from light to being incredibly rooted to the ground. Like he was impossible to foot sweep. Just one of these people that just had this innate ability just to switch that on and off. So I'd practice coaching on him. He was a phenomenal coach. So we were working on it, and he had a shin guard. He had to have a shin guard on the back of his leg, because we'd spend like pretty much an hour with me just kicking him in the back of the leg in the morning. And then, and then it's one of those things that's just clicked in for a couple of years. And it's, again, another one of those throws that I use in terms of as a direct attack and just to set up. I love using coaches as a setup, but I think as a coach, I always remind my players that you're going to kick and be kicked.
Yeah.
And as that timing comes along, and it's just part of the process, unfortunately.
Right.
But just to persevere with it. And I try to set the expectation in terms of that longevity.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about with the guys, you said John Godwin? Yeah. When you talked about like weight distribution, that's something that's really hard to teach, but we know when we're facing somebody that really knows how to kind of, like you said, root their weight or seem really light in a minute later. And I think that's a high level skill that's very hard to articulate into words on, how do you, I was having this conversation with some of my adult beginners just this week, and we were talking about Yashuaza, and it's a lot about weight distribution. They start attacking my leg and I take my weight off it. It just kind of moves out of the way so simply. And I think those lessons are hard. It just takes feel. It's one of those things you just got to practice, but it's very low impact. It's very easy to practice. Like you were saying earlier in the conversation, once you get it figured out, it's a very easy way to run around. Sometimes I can do randori with my players, not even in super good shape, but I can go all night long because I'm really good at conserving and hitting the foot sweeps, and I can have a great time doing judo and very low impact on my body that's starting to age. So Yashuaza is the best, man. This is what judo is all about, and I think that anybody out there that's listening would attest to say that once you hit your first effortless foot sweep, you're hooked. You're going to just chase that and look for that feeling. I mean, that's what judo is all about. When you get that foot sweep, because sometimes you can land the big ogoshi, right? But you felt yourself. You grunted and groaned and you got them over. But when you get somebody to foot sweep perfect and they go flying through the air, you're like, sometimes you're surprised that it worked yourself. And that's the aim, I think. But and this has been a lot of fun. All of the listeners out there, you should go to judofanatics.com, go into the search bar and search up David's stuff. It's super good stuff. Got some great instructionals. Tell our listeners where else they can find you and give us a plug for your podcast as well.
Yeah, so the Judo Way of Life, you can pretty much search that, I think, on most things, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. So yeah, the Judo, I've got a website as well, and that's what the name of the podcast is, which can be found on Spotify and Apple and all those things. But yeah, if you go to thejudowayoflife.com, it's all there.
All right. David, this has been a lot of fun. I look forward to doing this again sometime, and I'm going to have to make an Australian vacation at some point and tour around, see my old buddies, and do some training. But it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, nice. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.